Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Secret Resume podcast, hosted by me, Melody Moore. In this podcast, we explore the people, places, and experiences that have shaped my guests, those which have influenced who they are as people and where they are in their work life today. You can listen in as we have a rich exploration of often unexamined and undiscussed, but very important aspects of their lives, or as I like to call it, their secret resume. My guest today is Ellie. Ellie is a certified coach, consultant, advisor, and an occupational psychologist by background. She specialises in supporting youth, apprenticeship, and edtech organisations and helping founders and leaders at all stages, whether that's supporting them in developing a new business or helping more established organisations to become even more effective. Ellie built her own education and recruitment-tech business in the youth market and worked as a vice president at a global apprenticeship provider. She also spent many years consulting to global organisations, working with leaders on issues ranging from job and organisation design to talent and performance. When she's not working, she's either hanging out with her 5 children, travelling the world with her husband, cooking, doing something sporty, or generally striving for balance. So thank you, Ellie. Really lovely to see you again, and thank you for inviting me around to your beautiful home. I'm no longer sat in a shipping container. I'm sat in Ellie's lovely home at her table in the kitchen.
And you're very privileged because I've turned the heating on.
I feel very honoured and warm, much warmer than a shipping container. So, really excited to be talking about your story. We know each other through working together. How long ago?
Yes.
10?
Unfortunately, I think it was a bit longer than that.
Time's gone so fast. A few years ago.
Yeah.
We used to work together, but you've been doing some really exciting things, I think, since then. So that's why I really wanted to interview you. So should we dive straight in? Are you happy to, you and I have had a
Sure,
chat beforehand about some of the things we're going to talk about. So should we start with, we started talking about your childhood, didn't we? And what you were like as mini Ellie.
Very annoying. No change. So I was reflecting when I was thinking about this podcast. I was reflecting on my childhood and just going back there to think of like, were there any themes that I, just this sort of constant from then to now, and this word of like independence just sort of popped into my mind, and so it just made me think back to like why is that and why was that?
So you being really independent.
Yeah.
And that's going to come up again as a theme throughout this, but it's something that you, looking back, you know that it's something that came right from being quite young.
Yeah, and I had an older, no, I still do have an older brother, and he's still older than me. But when I think back to our childhood, what I remember is him always being around my parents and them always being like downstairs or outside and together, and me in my room just on my own, playing, doing like scrapbooks of I used to be obsessed with taking pictures out of the Times Home magazine or on a Sunday. I couldn't wait to get, and then I'd cut out these pictures and I'd put them in a scrapbook, and I just really vividly remember sort of doing that, and being on my own a lot.
And what were the pictures of? Were the themes?
It was like houses that I wanted to live in the future, and then I'd like almost take elements of the different houses and then design my own in the scrapbook. And sometimes I think why did nobody say to me at that point, like, oh, like there's a job that you could do and get paid for where you like design houses and things, because I was just really sort of obsessed with it, really. And it's funny, isn't it, when you think about, well, because obviously I spent a lot of the last few years thinking about careers and early careers and stuff. Like, how did mum and dad not like grab hold of this thing and and encourage me in a certain direction? But very, very interesting. But that was a lot of my I remember my sort of childhood being, and my dad used to coach my brother's rugby team. So from the age of 5 to 18, so I have lots of memories of standing on, the sidelines, watching him. And I think all of those things just probably have shaped me to just being quite like on my own and independent.
So, and you were saying, I think, that you think it's probably a mixture of nature and nurture. You were perhaps more independent, but also the family dynamic was you were doing your own thing, and they were doing things more together.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And there came a point through school that you mentioned that you made this decision that you wanted to be head girl of the school. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. So in lower 6, so I was 16. That was the time at which you could choose to like be a prefect if you wanted, or head girl and deputy head girl, and I think I'd always felt like a level of just confidence and self-assurance about myself and my abilities. I was very like hardworking and conscientious, and so I feel like I literally woke up one day and was like, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to become head girl. And I just had this laser focus on then getting that job. And I feel like it was, and I was successful in getting it and doing it. And I think that was this first sort of external stamp of like approval, and that if you work hard and determined, etc., then you can achieve anything, and you can get anywhere you want to go. And so that was quite a big moment for me of like of that self-belief and that confidence.
And what was it? Why being head girl? What made you decide to do it?
I think partly achievement, like can I do it? And I think partly about external validation, both amongst my peers, because it's a voting. So it's partly the teachers and stuff voting you in on your ideas and things, and then obviously partly voting by the pupils themselves. So I think it gave me that internal and external validation. And also my brother was deputy head boy 2 years before.
Okay.
So I would lie if I would be lying if I didn't say there was probably an element of, look at you, golden boy. I can do one better.
Is it the same school?
No,
different school.
So I went to an all-girls school. He went to the all-boys school. And it was probably similar with GCSEs, and I think I was constantly trying to compete with him, because I felt maybe like I couldn't compete in other ways.
Right. Such as
attention was probably a big one. It felt like a lot of the focus was on Stuart and the stuff that surrounded him. So the school, my dad was head of governors at his school, my mum at the PTA at his school. he obviously had the rugby coaching of my dad. My dad coached rugby at the school as well. So it was very like his school and everything around it was very sort of central to a lot of our life in those early days.
Were they supportive of you going for head girl?
Well, so really interestingly, I think a few years ago it just came up in conversation with mum and dad, and they said something like, we just didn't really know what to do with you. Like, as in, you just come out and say, like, oh, I'm going to go and be head girl, and then you just went and did it. And, and it was, I was slightly taken aback by that, because I thought, like, what do you mean you don't know how to deal, like, you don't know how to deal with it? You also could just have really supported it, told me, like, how amazing I was and how proud you were of me and all of these things. But I don't, and maybe they did, and for which I apologise, but I don't remember those things. What I remember is them me going, oh, I'm going to go for her girl, and them going, oh, okay. Okay, you go off and do that, that type of thing.
But it reinforced you when you won it, got it. I don't know what the right word is. It validated this sense of you being able to do what you wanted to.
Yeah, and I think that naive belief, that just working hard and really being conscientious is the only thing that's gonna matter in life. Like when I start work, that's fine. I'll keep doing that, and I'll just be successful in everything I do.
Yeah, just work hard and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So you said earlier that you didn't know that, for instance, that there was a job that was building houses, or not building houses, designing houses.
Designing houses.
So when you went to university, you chose to go and study psychology.
Yeah, because no one told me that this thing existed where you could design houses and earn money from it. So no, I did A-level psychology, and I just fell in love with it. And I was just hooked and geeked out over that. Got an A in that. And
what was it that makes you geek out about it?
Just understanding people, and in particular why they're the way they are, and just that human behaviour. I think some of the things that I was less bothered about was like the child development aspects, and it was the the social conforming, the reinforcing behaviour, that all of that sort of stuff, those famous experiments of that actually how you can put somebody in a situation and then a totally different situation, then they will behave so differently based on the environment they're in. And so I just loved all of that. And then when I went to uni and learned about how you can apply all of that to the world of work, then I suddenly just felt like, right, this is it. Like, this is what I want to do.
And you said you had a real clarity around, you wanted a good job, you wanted a family. You seem to have quite I think compared to myself, I don't think I had a clear vision at all what I wanted.
Well, this is the thing, and the irony of like when, and obviously we'll talk about what I've been doing over the last few years, but where, there's this generation, who are like lost, confused, the world's moving so fast, they'll be doing jobs that don't exist yet, and there's me saying like it's okay not to know, and yet I had this crystal clear clarity when I was 18 of what I wanted to do, and at what age, and I did it, and all of those things fell into place at the time that I had envisaged that they would.
Yeah.
So it was like actually very dull in in that way, but also I actually feel really, I really empathised with people who didn't have that clarity in the way that I did, of which was pretty much everyone else, and I really feel for Gen Z now and Gen Alpha coming, and because how we can support them with thinking about their futures is still so far behind where it needs to be.
Mm-hmm. I think it's crazy that we expect people to know. I've got numerous nephews who are sort of university age, top of schools of sixth form and university, and I think it's crazy that we expect them to know what they want to do with their lives, or even when they're choosing GCSEs. It's people having clarity just seems, how could they possibly know?
Yeah,
but you did.
Yeah, so I did, and my clarity was that I wanted to, and actually I should say like where this stemmed from as well. It was again a really clear moment for me. I was at I picked my parents up from their golf club after a boozy lunch or whatever with their friends, and one of my mum's friends was, I was just chatting to her, and I don't know sort of how it came about, but she sort of almost grabbed my arm and she said to me, never don't have your own money, always be able to stand on your own 2 feet, because you'll never be able to basically like have choice, and and it really struck me, because she's normally so like light-hearted, fun, hilarious, but if there was this intensity in her eyes, and I thought, wow, like she feels trapped. She feels like she can't get out of this situation because she doesn't have a penny to her own, her own name, and that and that really stuck with me as well. And so there was this sort of combination of things, I think, that happened where it's like I knew I wanted to do like this job around people, occupational psychology, and I wanted to have a family, and I wanted to get a point in my career where that family didn't hinder me from still carrying on and earning my own money, and standing on my own 2 financial feet. When I was 18, I said, by the time I'm 30, I want to, be married, have a family, and then be able to kickstart my own like independent consulting business. And that's exactly what happened.
But there was also another family friend who was not quite the same messaging coming from them.
Yeah, and this is and this is sort of, I think, again, there's been some moments of like, oh wow, right, okay, with men, in various different ways, but again, sort of dinner party with mum and dad's friends when I was doing my masters, and so I was still living at home at that time, and this guy asked me like what my plan was, and I told him exactly what I just said, or this is what I like to do, and these are my goals and ambitions, and he just said, well, you're totally deluded if you think that's going to happen. And I was just like, wow, I'm 20. Like what part of you thinks that's a really good, encouraging thing to say to a single young female, and so, and I feel like that was the first time of having this, I don't know, this sort of challenge, or being sort of put down a bit, or maybe the first time I ever let it affect me.
How did you feel when you said that?
Well, driven by I'll show you. And I really just wanted to ring him up when I was like 30, and had my first child, and was leaving the organisation where we met, and I wanted to ring him up so much and just say, oh, that thing you said to me, like, look at me now. I've done it.
The irony is he probably doesn't even remember
Oh,
saying
he doesn't
it.
remember.
And it just was a passing remark to him.
Exactly.
And yet here we are, 20 years later, and you still remember.
Yeah. And again, I to my detriment, have let a lot of things that have happened from that point still, affect me. And I'm getting better at it, but still not there yet.
So there's a kind of there's a sort of independence that's forming. There's a clarity of what you want that's forming, but there's also a sort of I'll show you reaction to
a stubbornness.
Yeah.
I need to prove you wrong.
Mm-hmm. So you, after your masters, you then went on to work for a couple of different organisations, one of which is the one where we met. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges? I know you had some challenges in those organisations that you faced.
So this is, so again, I'm just really entering the workforce, 20, 21, 22. And so this is where I really learned that what I thought was true about, that just working hard and getting good grades and good qualifications are the things that really matter, will get me through and help me achieve whatever I want to. And in those early days, I faced both sexual and age discrimination. And the thing with those two is they're fixed. they're stuff that I can't change or develop. And as hard as it is sometimes to hear feedback, if it's, at least you can do something about it if it's, if it's developable. So I'm then feeling like I'm held back, or I can't do things because of my sex and because of how old I am.
Can you give an example of some discrimination you
faced? So my first boss, when I moved into consulting, he pretty much abandoned me for 3 months. And you know what that sort of environment, that culture is like. You have to be given opportunities to carve your way and build your networks and things like that. And so and again, I'm 22. And so 3 months went on, and we had our mid-year review, and I said to him, "Can I just ask why you haven't given me any opportunities, or that I haven't come to any meetings with you and stuff, because it's really difficult for me to start contributing without your support." And he said, "Well, the thing is, I just really question your credibility." And I said, "Okay, can you, say more about that?" And he said, "Well, I just think when, if I bring you into meetings and then people say, hear your really high voice and your long blonde, and see your long blonde hair, they just won't have any, treat you with any credibility." And how I held it together in that moment, I have no idea. But I went out and I just burst into tears in the toilets. But I said to him, "Okay, so what can I do about these things?" And he said, "Oh, well, I think you need to dress differently. Maybe wear trousers, maybe a scarf so you look a bit older. Put your hair up maybe." And then I was like, "Okay, so these are all things that I can change about my appearance. What would you suggest I do about my voice?" Which at that point I didn't realise was high. I didn't think it was very high, but suddenly, I've had this feedback that I've got a really high, uncredible voice. And he said, "Oh, well, I've already spoken to HR, so we're going to get you some voice coaching." I honestly just wanted this massive gaping hole just to swallow me up, and I said to him, okay, thank you for that, but do you know what I actually really need? Because what I said, I really need you just to put me on a project with you, and then you can see the work that I do, and see if it's if it's good, or someone else maybe senior in our team. And he's like, okay, but yeah, they've also mentioned similar things about your credibility. So now, not only him, but all of the senior people in that team have been, in my head, they've been chatting about me, how, and I'm like, but I've got all these qualifications. I just haven't had the chance to prove myself. So he said, okay, I'll put you on this project. And so that was one of the first sort of examples of this, and which, I then just absolutely, well, two things, absolutely knocked my self-confidence and self-belief, to bits for 15 years longer than I should have let it. And secondly, said, well, I'll blooming show you. And so
it sounds like it's been an interesting mix of those two things when you're getting these knocks.
Yeah.
There's part of you that feels crushed by it, and part of you that's like, F you.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you.
Yeah. And just to think, because I think it's interesting. We then had a review project, review meeting after the project, which went really well. And I anticipated that this was coming, and he said, Ellie, I can't help thinking that the feedback I gave you has been really helpful. And I said, can I just stop you there? It's absolutely ruined my confidence, and all it did was fuel my desire to prove you and every other senior person in this team wrong. And I just got up and walked out. Yeah, and so I feel like there's this constant dichotomy, of me really owning this self-worth, and then having this crushing detrimental questions over my competence all the time, and how that's played out is that I felt like I've had to work 3 times harder than anyone else to prove myself, and then going in, and similar around the age stuff. I remember going to do a job evaluation training course, and they're not inexpensive, these courses. No. I come in, I've probably delivered 50 by this point. And the HR manager, I walk into the room, the first thing she says to me is, oh my God, you're so young. Immediately, I'm like, well, I've got to smash this out of the park. So then I'm up all night in between the 2 sessions, making sure the second day is going to be incredible for them. And, and obviously I get 8s and 9s on the feedback forms, but again, it's this thing of why is that okay to say to someone that they look so young, that they've got a high voice, that they, their blonde hair's putting you off, that shaped the whole of my 20s.
It's funny, I was thinking about consulting the other day, and how it's an unusual job in that you constantly get feedback and you constantly get evaluated, particularly if you're working in any kind of role where you're delivering a lot of training or workshops or what have you. You are constantly being evaluated and judged and given feedback, and it does require a robustness that because they're just people's opinions at the end of the day, but it can be quite people can be quite thoughtless, I think.
Definitely. But also that is okay and valuable and warranted if the feedback is based on something that you can do something about. that's what I mean about this sort of fixed versus growth thing. Like the feedback I'm hearing has nothing to do with the quality of my work. It's all about stuff that I can't really change.
Well, and quite fundamental to who you are. Your voice, your hair, your look, it's absolutely. But it's just people's judgments and biases coming out.
Yeah.
And during that period, so there was two different organisations that you worked with, and the one where you and I worked together, that's also where you met your husband. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that, because again, there's a degree of sexism that you were experiencing around that.
Yeah. So we fell in love under a cloud, let's say, in less than ideal circumstances, and I should say that we're coming to our 13th year of marriage, and probably closer and happier than we ever have been, which is amazing, and that started from quite a high bar. But yeah, when that was a really challenging time when it was out, everyone knew that we were together and things like that, and there was a situation where we were outside of work, and an informal thing, and my husband and I had a kiss. The next day, my boss brought me into a little meeting room and said that she'd had a complaint from one of the other staff that we'd been kissing and that it wasn't appropriate, even though it was outside of work. And the first thing I said to her was, has my husband's boss also had this feedback, and is he also in a room being told that there's a complaint? And she said no. And I said, well, I'd like you to go and tell him, and I'd like him to go into a room and be complained at as well, so that it feels fair, even though it's totally unjust. We're not doing anything wrong, but that was an example of then what followed, which was a lot of negativity targeted towards me, the single female.
And he's older and was senior, was he?
Yes,
well?
He was a director and I was a consultant in totally different teams, so we didn't really work together, but people would say things like, I'm only with him to advance my career and get promoted, and just the total irony that it was it probably held me back more than advanced anything. And just again a great example of it was easier to target me and to hurl stuff at me than it was to him, both probably because of the level that he was at and because he is a male.
And did that form part of your decision to leave then?
Yes and no. I felt like it was becoming difficult for us to stay in the same organisation. It's not a big one, and I think again I probably felt like I was having to prove myself even more. But also at that point I was on this path, of the ambition that I set out when I was 18 to get enough of the really solid foundation in my experience such that I could go and set up and do my own independent thing. So I think it was, probably a combination of the two.
And so that's what you did next. You left, you set up as an independent consultant.
So we got married, we had our first child, and then after he was born, then I left the organisation and set up, freelance.
How was that as an experience? It was what you'd been aiming for? It's been what you thought you wanted?
yeah, so for a period of time, I loved it, and it was great. But I still remember this painful imposter syndrome of and still these voices of oh, people are gonna hear your voice or look at you and think you're really young. What have you possibly got to help them with? All of that. So that didn't really go away.
At this point, you're what, in your?
I was
late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah. And but I was doing what I wanted to do, and earning decent money, and that was perfect for the time of our life. And I went on, we had another son, and my husband was in quite a demanding global role. He was traveling a lot, so it really worked for us at that time. And then as my second son got a bit older and we could get into a bit more of a routine, that's when I realised the thing that I was really missing from independent consulting life, which was the opportunity to still really challenge and push myself and learn and really be out of my comfort zone. And again, this is the weird dichotomy with me of this. I want to push myself and I'm really shit scared about doing it, but at the same time have this innate belief, in myself and my self-worth.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. There seems like there's a real dichotomy there of the sort of...
Yeah, it's messed up. Trying to navigate that every day.
It must cause some interesting conversations in your head.
Yes. This is why I'm so exhausted all day. Don't actually do anything.
Just argue with yourself.
Yeah, just sit and think. So that led me on this, then, what is the entrepreneurial...
The entrepreneurial years.
Yeah. Path and things, because I was not getting fulfilled at that time. There was a big piece missing, which was this propensity to learn, this curiosity, this pushing myself into different directions. So then I had just a really big think about what used to really energize me, and because obviously, as we do lots of different types of projects, and that was that variety was great. But and I always used to think, when coaching senior people, and they have these aha moments and stuff, I think, if only I knew this about myself, at the start of my career, I'd make different decisions. And I used to love doing sort of early talent type work and assessments and designing things like that. And so I thought, right, I'm going to start just rereading around early careers and at the time my 3 stepkids were emerging out of sort of early secondary school and into these key decision making points themselves. And I was like, wow, there's and this was the emergence of the 5th industrial revolution's coming, all these jobs that don't exist now, 45% of the jobs or whatever that exist now won't in 15 years. And I was thinking, gosh, how must they all be feeling, whether they're really being equipped for the world of work and stuff. So I got really sort of geeky about it all, and then really frustrated and passionate about the careers landscape. Yeah, so this sort of led me down this path then of firstly building a business which was about supporting people in socially disadvantaged backgrounds to access the same sort of level of support when it comes to interviewing and assessment centres and things like that. Because I was, employers were saying it's not necessarily that we struggle to attract diverse talent, say, into our graduate programs, but they're not getting through the assessment centre. They're not polished as the word, and we all know what that really means. And so, yeah, it meant I was then able to create this like whole sort of, you know, scenario of like this sort of blended digital virtual assessment centre to, like, you know, develop the try before they do it, really. And the impact of these events was amazing on disadvantaged young people. So like 45% reduction in anxiety, having gone through this experience, 33% increase in confidence to even consider that they might go for a job now. So it was huge, and it just really eye-opening as to the barriers that different minorities face around this stuff, and the networks of support. And so it led me, because I don't know when to stop with my ambitions, it led me to go, okay, no, it's not just minority people. There is this whole generation who are lost, confused. We're not, like, careers advice is archaic. No one's prepared for what's coming, and how can we be? But let's at least engage them in the world of work and advice and guidance in a way that they're used to consuming information. And that's how then my business Fledgling started, which at the heart of it, you know, was an app, like a careers advisor in their pocket, really focused on school leavers and unemployed young people who aren't going to uni but aren't sure what path to take. And what was quite unique about it was the focus on moving away from grades, where you went to school, all of that stuff, and smart matching them to, you know, opportunities with the digital CV in the app that was trying to capture and validate the things that really matter of a 16, 17, 18-year-old: strengths, qualities, attributes, personalities, things that are observable by their peers, that can be quantified somehow, and using all of that to match to their, you know, company's values, competencies of an apprenticeship, etc. And so, yeah, and it also became, and hence the name, you know, Fledgling was that stepping stone from Instagram, TikTok to, you know, suddenly this LinkedIn, which was really overwhelming, you know, as that first professional platform, and you don't really feel like you've got much to say about yourself, like really plugging that sort of gap for them as well.
Interesting. And that was at that time you were a solo female entrepreneur,
mother,
yeah, going through rounds of raising funds. Say a bit about that.
Yeah. So I raised 2 rounds of investment for this business, which I'm actually really, you know, now I can look back and say, wow, I'm so proud of that. And going in, you don't realise the landscape that you're going into, and actually how much of a challenge that was, that I achieved that, because, you know, I think it's moved slightly, the dial now, but, you know, when I was raising investment, 1p in every pound, only 1p in every pound went to a female founded business, which is, you know, just terrible. And so, and often they're, you know, that's with co-founders, with people who, you know, founders who don't have children, you know, who could work 24 hours a day if they chose. And so being, a sole founder, female mother, it was like, right, how many other barriers do you want to give yourself to like try and raise this investment? But I just so passionate about what I was trying to do, and I could see how needed this was and is still, you know, in the market, that I just every day kept me going, even the days when didn't want to get out of bed. It was the thing that I sort of needed to keep pushing on because I believe so much in it. But they were, again, sat in rooms with privileged middle-aged white men grilling me for 3 hours, and leaving some of those just like absolute floods of tears. It was so intimidating. And just really interesting, the use of language, I think, as well. And there's been studies on when male founders and female founders go and pitch, the way in which questions are phrased back to them are unconsciously, but very different.
And such as
with males, the questions will be more about like positively framed and about opportunity. And with women, and this is like significantly different. I'm not just making this up, because there's been some really fascinating studies on it, where investors will tend towards what is the risk. So this sort of aversion and this risk type of question, which then limits the opportunity, rather than, it's like, reducing it rather than exploring what's the art of what's possible. Whereas with males, these questions are unconsciously framed in a much more positive, opportunistic way.
So how do we take this and make it into a bigger opportunity rather than what are the risks of, and let's try and minimise the risks. Interesting. So what happened with Fledgling? This was all pre-COVID, you were setting it up.
Yeah, so just as COVID hit, I was going out to raise 1.2 million. So we were, it was a shoestring. Like, what we managed to achieve with what I had raised also is incredible. And when I look back now, I have to be so proud of what I did with that money compared to some of my male counterparts, with raising significant amounts more than I was. And so we got to a really good place with it. And ironically, with this lockdown, school shutting, suddenly careers advice needed to go digital. This was the perfect opportunity to properly scale it, and I couldn't raise the money. And I can spend a whole other podcast going into why, different reasons as to why, and it's not all external. I'm not just saying, it was the investment landscape. There was stuff about the business in general that made that challenging. Again, made investors go, a bit risky. And so ultimately, last October, I ended up selling the app and the brand to this amazing charity, youth charity in the UK called Speakers for Schools, which was started by Robert Peston and funded by amazing philanthropist, and parted ways with it. But it was like I'd lost a child. It sounds crazy saying that now, but I was devastated. I was so broken, but I couldn't see the distinction between me and it. And I was that innate thing of like, just work really hard, like work all the hours. One more conversation might change the course of events. It didn't happen, and it was, and it was just devastating. Another example of all the work, everything around me going, Ellie, just you working harder is not going to mean success here. There's all these external events that no one predicted, that that you can't survive, this can't survive, and don't take this all on yourself as a failure, you know. But at the time, that's all I felt, just like I'd failed, like me, society, young people, investors.
That's big.
Yeah,
the world.
I took it all. I felt it all, and it just it broke me. So it was a tough time.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you went on to work in a VP role for an organisation.
Yeah, and if it wasn't for doing fledgling, and you know, people have said to me, if you knew all you know now, would you have done it? Because it did, you know, it took its toll on me, on my family. Obviously, I took investment, but I actually wouldn't change it for the world, because in that moment, in that time, though, you know, those 3 years, I felt on top of the world. I felt I felt like I'd arrived, almost. Like I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore.
And that was the first time you felt like that?
Yeah. And it was so different from all those judgy people in my head, you know, and I was so far removed from what I used to be doing, and I think that really helped as well. And it's really interesting because I had coaching around, you know, when things were then not going so well, I was like, oh gosh, all these people are going to be like, oh yeah, no, I knew that wasn't going to work out, or yeah, nice try, you know. But my coach said to me, who are these people? And I was like, oh, you know them. Like, those people on LinkedIn and whatever. And he's like, can you put any names to these people? I was like, no, but you know, like, they're just there. I was like, is it possible they're just in your head? And I was like, damn. But, you know, and it was helpful. It's like, actually, who do I care about? Like, whose opinion do I now care about? Like, I know I can name the people who I used to care about their opinion, even though I shouldn't have let them get in my head. But now they're not the same people, you know,
and how many of them have gone and done what you did? None of them.
Yeah. So it's a journey. I'm still, you know, but now that was such a helpful comment, because when I start to have that like self-doubt or that sort of social anxiety about stuff, I'm like, okay, who are these people, Ellie?
I think it's a really quite good question, isn't it? Who is they? We talk about they a lot. They say they and no one and everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've recently gone back to setting up as an independent consultant again.
Yes, yeah. So I've gone full circle.
Yeah. So 10 years roughly after you did it the first time around.
Without giving away my age.
What's different now?
So what's different now is, I think, two things in particular. I didn't feel... So when I was 30, I still clearly had this need to go and do something that really pushed me and that's really like stretched my like learning to the limit and stuff like that. And that was still obviously a really big part of like who I was and my self-identity at the time. I don't feel that way anymore. And it's not to say that I won't have this continuous curiosity for like learning things. Like for example, I've just done an online MBA and so, you know, coaching qualification and everything. So I think like that will always be there. And so when it comes to like this phase of freelancing and things, like I'll always be wanting to learn new things, new techniques, like new ways of doing stuff. But it's less of the like piece of the pie chart, you know, when it comes to all the other things that is actually really important now in my life. And the second thing is that imposter syndrome of I don't know anything, I have nothing to share with people, I've just got like theoretical knowledge and no practical real world, like, you know, how you actually lead people, or, you know, through different scenarios has gone. And just, yeah, that life, I think that life experience and me just giving myself a bit more of a break as well, not being so hard on myself. So I'm really excited about this, you know, this time round, being a freelance coach and consultant, because I actually feel now really uniquely placed to help lots of different people. You know, yes, I've done my core learning and theory, then I've been a consultant, worked with, you know, got that real foundational experience and worked with a lot of companies. Then I've ran my own business, and then I've been in the senior leadership team of a unicorn. And now I'm excited to almost bring all of that together and help other people and organisations with, you know, with those three very different bits of my career.
Really interesting, an unusual mix, I think. And if you were to talk to a younger version of Ellie, you choose what age, doesn't have to be a childhood version, it could be any younger version, what would you say to them?
Yeah, so I was reflecting on this quite a lot. It was quite cathartic, really. But where, like, the one thing that I've landed on, you know, because I was thinking about letting people creep in, you know, letting all of that in, and like, and just, you know, don't listen to them and blah blah blah. But actually, like, the thing that I think is really important for younger Ellie, if I could say it, is that success is holistic, not reductionist. So I think I spent my whole life basically viewing, you know, success as what I was achieving in work, you know, and others' feedback on, like, this aspect. And that was the thing that really fueled my self-identity until, you know, pretty much until like that breakdown, you know, with fledgling, that, you know, it's just that was what I identified with, you know, success, achievement. And actually I'm so successful in so many things. Like, I'm a great mum. I'm a great stepmom. I am a good coach. I'm a great friend. I'm a great daughter. I'm a great wife. I cook well. I play golf well. And I'm all right at work. But don't define your success just by your achievements in work, because it is one bit of your life. So go and live your life to the full and be proud of all the successes that you have in all different parts of your life, and remember them. If some, you know, when you're self-doubting yourself about work, or someone's given you some really unhelpful feedback that you can't do anything about, you know, like, remember actually how amazing you are at all these other things.
And if you were to think of a title or a strapline for your story, what would that be?
So again, it's back to that theme. Watch me prove you wrong.
Love it. So thank you, Ellie.
Pleasure.
That's been absolutely fascinating. It's amazing how much you learn about someone who you think you already know when you sit down and interview them for an hour. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
No, it was really nice, and I feel very honoured to be asked. So
You're very welcome. I really enjoyed my conversation with Ellie, and I really want to thank her for being so honest and open about some of the challenges that she's faced. I was really struck by a couple of things that we talked about in the podcast. One was about always having your own money as a woman. That's something that is very dear to my heart as well, and something I strongly believe in. The other thing was the sort of potential of our throwaway words and how they can have a crushing and long-lasting effect on someone else, particularly someone who's young and impressionable, and how we sometimes perhaps don't realise that. And then I think the final thing that Ellie said was her advice to her younger self really struck me, about the fact that success is holistic. It's not just one-sided, it's not just how you do in work, it's how you do in all aspects of our lives. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Secret Resume. If you did, remember to like, share, comment and subscribe, as that helps people like you find people like us.